and we're back with the topic of inclusive recruitment. I have with us our new guest, Francoise de Sutter. Please correct me if I mispronounce your name.
No, I think it's fine. Francoise de Sutter.
Thank you. Francois, you work for Wayfair, where you're responsible for DEI, talent acquisition program management. Is that right?
Yes.
Great to
Yeah,
have you.
exactly.
Great to have you here with us today. And we're in the spirit of making sure that we use inclusive language and making sure that everyone knows what we're talking about. So I will ask you the first question to clarify the term that will be used a lot in this conversation, diverse sourcing. What does it mean for those who are not in the recruitment field?
Good question. So when it comes to the recruitment process, you have generally two types of applicants. So one is the inbound, so anybody who is actively applying to a role, and then you have outbound, so people who are being passively approached by our teams, or as we call, are being sourced. And then diversity sourcing is the practice of approaching potential candidates from underrepresented groups.
So why does it matter at the end of the day?
Yes. So first of all, um, when it comes to applying to different roles and growing our talent, um, as has been mentioned, I think also in this conference, is not everybody applies to roles, of course, because they either feel they don't fit all of the qualifications 100%. But also another interesting part is that for many folks, especially from underrepresented groups, they may be more reticent to move companies or move roles, particularly if the companies or the areas they're in already provide them with all the benefits that they need, especially if they're a caregiver, for example, or any kind of like inclusive practices in the company, which is also very important as a company to make sure that we can also provide them those benefits or those inclusive spaces. And then, of course, also increasing our talent pool internally, because then that will also help us grow and be representative of the population, and as well make sure that we're growing and providing more innovation to our business.
From what I'm hearing, I can imagine that data can be extremely important to understand where you are in your diverse sourcing. Am I right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. When it comes to recruiting, and particularly with sourcing, you cannot do it without any data. Particularly in Europe, since we are so many different countries, and diversity it can have many different meanings according to the population, according to the different geography. That's why it's very pivotal to use data not only to find this a type of talent, but also in order to ensure that we can use the best ways to attract them and give them a good candidate experience process.
When I hear the word data as a DNI practitioner, it's a red light for me always going on, and I hear it a lot from other DNI practitioners, as we struggle a lot at collecting and maintaining the high quality people data. What is your recommendation how to get started with people data when it comes to diversity sourcing?
hmm So when it comes to data, of course, the word is very broad, right? So we need to break it down to what does data for diversity sourcing really mean. So normally I would define it into two ways. So the first one is external and internal data. So external is, for example, candidate application data. So I know because all across Europe we abide by GDPR. How are some companies are able to ask their candidates to already disclose their gender at the application process on an entirely voluntary basis, of course. And all this data will be remaining confidential, just being used for statistical purposes. Another type of external data is also partnerships. So partnering with other, like for example, like groups of a particular population, then can give you some insights and data into the representation of this group within the particular city or country that you're aiming to recruit from. So when it comes to internal, there are also different areas. So one of them being the self-identification survey, which some companies also have started to implement. So asking candidates as well, also voluntarily and confidentially, their gender and ethnicity, race, disability, and more. And then, of course, we also have employee resource groups or affinity groups that they can give you an overview of the population within these groups. So, most of the time, it will be approximate because you have folks who are part of them as being representative of these groups, but then you also have allies. And then we can also leverage data from tools on the sourcing process. So, of course, we can get some information from LinkedIn Recruiter, but when it comes to diversity sourcing, one of the most popular ones are Hire Easy and Tello, for example, as well as Seek Out, that they don't only give you an overview of where the talent is, but also an overall talent mapping, which it can be super interesting in the sourcing process.
Oh, I can definitely say that you're excited about this topic. In Polish, we have a wonderful saying that even King Solomon cannot pour something from an empty jar. I love the saying. So I'm wondering, what are your recommendations for people who are in the recruitment field and want to diversify their candidate pool? At the same time, they hear that there is not enough diverse candidates applying. What are your recommendations? Maybe some ideas for unconventional methods for sourcing?
Um, yeah, so I think, of course, first of all, if there's no data that you can leverage first, like when it comes to diversity, or do look at other data that can give you insights on the hiring process for that role in the past. So conversion ratios, as well as like historical pipelines of where you hire not only talent for in the past for this, let's say, team, but also diverse candidates, which companies they came from, which locations. So normally, when it comes to diversity sourcing, I always encourage people to first look for the data that it's already available, even if it's not very overt in the diversity because, of course, of confidentiality. But other than that, besides some of the tools that I mentioned, we have, for example, Slack or Twitter. We also have Meetup, podcasts. It's also a really interesting tool to use. Of course, make sure to strengthen your partnerships with your employee resource groups. I always say this, do this carefully because, of course, they are doing ERG work on top of their day-to-day job. So if there's somebody already doing partnership with them, use that person instead. Also, I think the other maybe not, I guess, less unconventional ways is hiring events as well. So I think there's many different ways like people can source. Like whenever there's people, social media or any kind of environment, you can use that as a sourcing. Like I think I've also used Reddit in the past.
I hear a lot of opportunities, so we shouldn't be hearing people complaining about lack of diversity in the pool of candidates.
And a lot of wonderful enthusiasm there. So congratulations on
Yes,
that.
exactly. We're running out of time, but there's one question which I think is particularly important to voice it here, and maybe you can answer quite quickly on it. How do you limit biases, stereotyping biases, affinity bias, etc., when doing diversity sourcing? Diversity sourcing is super important, but so difficult to do objectively. Katrina is asking.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. I think like nowadays a lot of the tools do provide like a bias analyzer or bias tool. So you can turn that on. Even LinkedIn does it. So you can hide all names and all pictures, or you use only acronyms. So that's one way to not be biased by the pictures or also the names of the people. But the second thing is definitely be aware of your own biases. So before you start diversity sourcing, you need to like dive deeper into understanding what DI means and all our biases. I always say that, of course, it's very hard to overcome all of them, but it's always very important to be aware of the ones you have.
Bias analyzer, fascinating and terrifying, all in one.
Well, thank you for joining us and providing more insights about diversity sourcing. It was very insightful. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much.